Hello, everyone. Welcome back at the Vested Summit. We have a very exciting panel discussion coming up with the promising title, Solving Climate Change, a Data-Powered Revolution. Wherever you're tuning in from, if it's Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn, you can always drop your questions. If you have any, this panel discussion is packed. We have a lot of wonderful guests. And I would like to invite Sherief to start maybe with introducing your panel members. Yeah, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Amber. It's a lovely introduction. I welcome everyone who's tuned in virtually or anywhere from the world. We have a very interesting panel about climate change and with the focus on the data-driven power. I have guests, actually I've just got to know each other from London, Kamil, Kluza, we have Mike Edwards, also from the UK, near London, and Prateep from India. I'm talking to you today from Germany, and we have Amber from Aruba, right? Say her correctly. So I would love to start with a small introduction and then get to know, raise some questions and have an interactive panel discussion with my guests. And if anyone in the audience, they have any question, then please join in and raise it to my guests. So I have been in the last 5 to 6 years, actually during my PhD, researching and also an aspect of climate change and how is renewable energy affecting in general, how can it reduce the climate change effect. And from my aspects as economic policies, I have been more involved with the policies from countries, rather staying on a macro level. How are these policies effective? Are they effective in general or not? We have seen that most of the policies passed by the EU or the OECD countries, they're very ambitious. However, they have actually none of the policies have met or reached the targets that have been set. So there has been a gap between what the governments are really pushing for and what we're really seeing on ground. And this has different reasons. But one of the reasons that I guess it will be relevant to our discussion is actually to understand that climate change cannot be just changed by enforcing policies. It's not just the government has to fight climate change by empowering policies, and then the people, they have just to follow, or they are just an even byproduct. And this is, I guess, it's one of the interesting things that when I saw my guests and their company spectrum, I have seen an interesting distinction here, because they work on very different levels. Mike, for example, and then he can later introduce the company in depth, but then he really focused on the micro level. So he doesn't target, I mean, the government, or this is how I understood it, but you really address the person at the end. This is the client. So we talk to the individual. And I strongly believe that climate change has to be fought endogenously. It has, the energy has to come from within the system. The people has to fight climate change, not from the macro level that reflects on the micro level. So, and then we go even steps further. We go from the individual to the weather, and here comes Kamil, and then we even get higher to the space with satellites, and this is Prateep. So this is actually will be the sequence of my questions. So I would love to start with the individual, okay, persons, how Mike is using sounds to address, get people nearer to the nature, to make them even love the nature, to protect it. So I'd love to introduce our first guest, Mike. Lovely to have you here. And I would love to get to know a little bit more about sound matters and how do you just let's introduce the company first and then we go further.
Sure. Thanks, Sherief. Thank you for having me. Very, very privileged to be here and to share, some sort of information, stories about the work we do. And it's quite interesting to be on a panel about data, because I've shied away from data now, having worked in my early career with a lot of data around climate change. My PhD was on the links between climate change and human security, looking at how changes in climate could actually lead to conflict and war. And so I was very much those were in the very early days when, the IPCC reports were just starting to come out, and there was a great deal of concern about what could be happening. So I was sort of basically using data to build scenarios around possible impacts, and then out of that trying to come up with some policy statements or processes. But it was whilst I was doing that, I started to realize, and this is just from my very personal perspective, that data wasn't going to change behavior, and I hate to say it, I think we're still seeing that that's the case. However much data we throw at people, it doesn't lead to that sort of change of heart. And so I became fascinated by how we sense the world, how we actually make sense of some of these crises we face, but beyond that, how we connect. And I was working in Australia, so I became fascinated by Aboriginal connection to land, and how Aboriginal people how they had survived for 40 to 60,000 years on perhaps the most inhospitable continent, but using such a limited range of resources and tools in effect. And it came down to the fact that they had an intimate connection with their landscape, what they call country, the stories, landforms, plants, animals, whatever it might be, and had adapted brilliantly to changing climate. And I was like, well, how can we potentially use that model? And that was, again, in the early days before this whole idea of indigenous ways of seeing, sensing became almost popularized as it has done now. And fundamentally, what it's about is about listening to the land. It's about being receptive to what the land's telling you. And that's really where my interest sort of developed, in that whole idea of listening. And then it was coming back to the UK, meeting up with who's now business partner, Harry Code, who's a musician, sound engineer and producer. We were like, well, how can we create new stories around the threat of climate change, which actually touch people's hearts? I'm very conscious that unless we do that, we can create as much data as we want around the issue, but it's almost going to be irrelevant unless people know why they're connecting to the issue of climate change. So that's what Sound Matters tries to do, using sound and the art of listening to actually get people to connect to the issue, which then I think the data-driven approach can then have more impact. And that's what we do.
Thanks, Mike. I love the introduction. It's exactly what I was thinking about, talking about. Also, after my research, we have seen that more and more, after every analysis, we see that the policies are not really meeting the targets. And the question comes back to the individuals. Are we really ready to fight climate change? Do we really want to fight climate change? And that's why I found the last sentences and all, definitely the introduction, exactly addressing this point that we need to connect the people back to the nature. I listened to some tracks, and it's fascinating because it's like, oh my God, I'm just in the middle of a forest now. And, I want to keep this for a couple of years. I want to enjoy also like a nice winter with snow. And so from the individual, I want to fight climate change better than having, it's not say better than having, but it's like we see the extreme changes in weather, and we have seen that actually last couple of days in the US, they had like a hurricane and
exactly.
huge losses in lives. And these extreme events in weathers, uh, it leads to extreme dangers. And here comes actually our second company with Kamil and ClimateX, which use this quantifies the weather events to help companies make better decisions and precise ones. So the floor is yours, Camille. I would love to know more about ClimateX. So please tune in.
Awesome, thank you. And hi everyone, my name is Kamil Kluza. I take care of the product build and implementation at ClimateX. Maybe before I jump into the company, a bit about myself. I'm a statistician. So I used to build all sorts of models within financial services for nearly 15 years. And then what we typically would do is stress test the system and just see what happens if, I don't know, China goes to war with US, or what if interest rates spike, or if the GDP tanks. That we've never tested for climate, and what's going to happen if the extreme weather events would get stronger and more frequent. So effectively, that's what ClimateX is doing. So we project long-term into the future and different carbon emission scenarios, the extreme weather events. So things like hurricanes, floods, subsidence, coastal erosion, and so on. And we make it actionable by attaching a pound or a dollar estimate to it. So if you put it in perspective, what we're trying to say is at an asset level, if you have a nice house in, I don't know, Cornwall, and then it's by the seaside, that we can tell you that in 25 years' time, it will suffer through the sea level rise, flooding, as well as some subsidence. And if it's worth $1 million today, it might be worth half of it in the future. So it's the asset level intelligence that we do provide to sort of help steer the decisions of the future, but it's also a bit of a stick and a carrot approach. So people don't tend to act or do anything unless they're actually being shown how much it's going to cost them. So it's basically, if you act now, you might be able to prevent this, because under higher emission scenarios, your future doesn't look so bright.
Thanks, Mike. I guess it's very nice to understand the business idea behind the company. Even it raises a lot of questions for me. But before digging deeper into questions, I guess it's one of the very challenging topics for climate change that I also got raised a couple of times in academia, is how can we explain climate change to the individuals? It's a lot of chain of reasoning, a lot of events happening after each other, that then when you understand all of them, then you can understand what's happening with climate change. Because it's not, climate change is not a hot day in the summer, or a hotter day in the summer, or a little bit of weather changes. Climate change is it's a bigger aspect. We see the average temperature of the earth increasing, and how this affects all our life aspects. So explaining to the individuals what climate change is a very tricky part, or it's not an easy part, that actually was research in academia. When you showing to the individuals that, hey, I will show you, in the future, what will be the situation to your house. So you really individualize the general effect of climate change to the person. I guess this is really going to make them understand climate change way better, and hopefully also join the forces to fight it. Now we get from the weather, and I'm very much looking forward to understand now the image from the space. And it's for me like it's spaces is always a fancy domain. I don't understand it myself. I'm more like an on the ground person, because when I read the first time about Satsure or Satsure, how do you pronounce it, Prateep?
It's Satsure.
Satsure, Satsure, and so also the business model behind it and how you're using AI, using data, and also fighting climate change or helping understanding climate change. Then I had a huge amount of questions, especially with the real-time data and all this. So the floor is yours, Prateep. So please also introduce yourself, introduce your business, and then we dig deeper after.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi everyone. My name is Prateep Basu, and I'm the founder and the CEO of Satsure. We are a 4-year-old company, so fairly young company based out of India, in Bangalore. So the entire premise of Satsure was how do we use data from space to create better risk management practices within different industries. So it's fairly broad. However, some use cases I'll elaborate on that. But since you mentioned about the data from space angle, I think it's a very obvious choice to make because the data collection capacity from satellites orbiting the Earth is tremendously large. It's at planetary scale, and the good thing is we have been collecting such data from the last many decades. So when we are doing any kind of climate change studies, data from space forms an integral part of these kind of research. Now, what we are doing is we are not trying to mitigate anything. I think climate change is almost irreversible. What we have done to our planet in terms of the water cycle and the carbon cycle. However, what we need to learn is use data to adapt to that climate change. And in that it is in that adaptation which we are assisting by providing insights such as the places which can be termed as too risky for financial institutions to lend or insure. And that's very it is another way of exclusion of marginalized communities already. And what through by using the data by creating insights out of the data, we are essentially providing ways to assess and reduce the cost of risk and also the cost of transactions for providing loans to, for example, smallholder farmers who are in drought risk of frequently drought hit or flood hit areas. We are assisting in speedy claims settlements of insurance companies so that the transaction and administrative cost of insurance administration reduces, and they can continue to penetrate and provide such kind of financial products because finance is very essential for resilience to climate change, and without data you really can't do much. So we'll dwell on that more, but that's the crux of what we do at Satsure. We are a bunch of data scientists, remote sensing people. I myself come from an experience at the Indian Space Research Organization. So does half of my team. So yeah, there we are.
Very nice, very nice. Prateep, as you see, it's like I'm very glad actually to moderate this session with very innovative solutions. And while you said that we're not trying to mitigate climate change, I just like you said, it's climate change is irreversible. I also understand that climate change is irreversible. We don't want to get and we will not be able to get the Earth cooler. But we were just trying to decrease the pace of how the Earth is getting warmer. Because as you see, and especially your company, and I checked also what you're doing with the crops, for example, and the food insecurity, and we know the effect of climate change. The more warmer it gets, the less inhabitant spaces will be, and then the more lands or less lands will be available for crops, and this could lead to food insecurities, and the chain of events is really huge. So thanks all for introducing how your company, yourselves and your companies. I guess it's very interesting to understand how everyone tries to tackle the topic of climate change. Again, I see a very varied panel of guests. We got a question, and it's also a very interesting question about if there is any hope in changing our habits to tackle climate emergency and build a more sustainable environment. So I guess the question is very interesting because it really addresses again addresses the micro level and the person. We can raise the question and how to answer it, but again, like I like it a lot that it addresses the micro level, the person, because it is the person, the human, who is the one who will fight the climate change. So I will go again to Mike, and as we talked about it, yeah, you're trying to connect people to the environment. I'd love to hear from you. How do you see the clients, and how do you see the resonance of your work on connecting people to the environment? I guess you're mute, Mike.
Yeah, great
Yes,
question,
now you're
and thank you, Shireen. Shireen actually was one of my students in the past, so poor thing had to listen to me for many months. It's such a great question, and I suppose I'm coming from the position that we haven't necessarily understood the threat of climate change yet. You know, it's very easy to see it as a sort of manifestation of, you know, the results, let's say the results of industrialization. You know, there's more CO2, more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You know, we get a change of temperature. But I think we have to take a step back, because all our solutions at the moment are based around this idea that somehow technology is going to save us. And I think we need to take a step back and to start to construct climate change as a spiritual crisis. And it comes down to this idea of connection. It's the way we've come to treat the earth. We see it as a resource. We see it as something to exploit. And that's based on maybe 2,000 years of, you know, disconnection, you know, Western philosophy. And of course, there are many different philosophical schools and ways of thinking out there. But if you think about climate change discourse and you think about how we've got into this mess, it's the result of, you know, 2,000 years, as I say, of deep separation. And I think the only way we're going to create a more sustainable future is if we do just take a step back and we start to think, like, how do we reconnect? How do we connect to the biophysical systems that make life on Earth possible? I think once we've done that, then I think sort of what Kamil and Prateep are talking about becomes so important, because they allow us to adapt. They provide the data, which allows us to maybe, to an extent, mitigate, and then if we can't mitigate, to adapt. But unless we've made that fundamental connection, I think we will continue along the same trajectory. And that's for me where the crisis lies. And it's about redefining sustainability. It's about contextualizing climate change. We've drawn climate change out as this issue. We've separated it. And in so doing, we've completely lost touch with the overall system. You know, we've lost it. We do not think of a system anymore, you know, and that's part of that connection. So my work is very much, I wouldn't say it's essential, although I'd like to think it is, But, you know, it's that baseline work from which all these brilliant approaches, the technology, the analysis, the AI, can then be built on. But unless we've got that foundation of why we're doing it, then I think we're going to be losing ourselves in the ether. And so that connection piece, but it's very difficult to sell that. Who's going to invest in a bunch of sort of hippies who are trying to say, hey, connect to nature is the solution? People don't invest. They're going to invest in a bit of tech, but are they going to invest in the process of connection, of that deep, you know, that deep spiritual connection? And I think that's the key, and that's the struggle, and that's what we have to address. And then, as I say, then all of us come together and we're powerful forces for change, and that's when the sustainability question can be addressed.
Thanks, Mike. And you're definitely right about how can we investments, and now we are Invested Summit, so we are addressing investments, and harvest is the motto of the summit now. But what I liked is how you're positioning yourself, or at least like from the impression that I got, is how you address sound matters in the market and how the connection works to the individual. So it's like, and immediately the impression I got from the website and listening to some tracks is that it affected me as an individual. So this connection means that we need it. Actually, with being so busy and every day and going to the office and going to traffic, I was happy to take some time and listen to a very high quality audio that makes you really calm down. And I guess with calm down, I live in middle of Germany, in the middle of a forest, and it's an amazing area. And these sounds really remind me of the time that I used to get out and really enjoy the environment around me.
That's what makes us human.
Exactly.
It's that deep connection.
Exactly. So it's like I guess if investment-wise, when we talk about this, I guess there will be definitely, and there are investors who see the potential because it affects every one of us. So it's a huge opportunity in itself immediately.
Gents, I might be a bit controversial on the matter because I'm quite cynical when it comes to changing consumer behavior. I think it could potentially even take decades. And there will be always people that are just going to plainly say no, and they'll find a way out. So I think this is also when the role of the governments and the policymakers come in to basically whip into shape all the residual people that are actually not really following through and not trying to understand. So I'm thinking, and
those policymakers have cut him off.
Yes. He didn't even finish the sentence, and then it was like got offline.
You've been cut off by your government.
So I'm talking about things like carbon tax, as well as basically just making people realize and presenting them with hard facts that this is going to cost you this much if you don't change or act fast. And I think it's a combination of all those things really to make it happen. Because if we're trying to sort of get people off meat, like I don't believe that it will be 100% successful. However, there's so many bioengineering startups at the moment that are growing meat in the lab, they're growing fat in the lab, and quite frankly, they taste it and it tastes exactly the same. It's just I think it's an army of or a sort of a palette of options, if you like, that probably need to be cropped and applied at the same time. And I think, Mike, what you're trying to do is probably the hardest, in a way that technology is something you can tame and people is something you cannot.
And interestingly, I mean, I won't say much more, but we do use, this is the thing, we're not technophobes. We do use technology. We take data, we sonify that data to try and create meaningful experiences where that data can then have a true impact because it's touching people's hearts. We turn it into music, basically. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Kamil. It's a palette. It's not one or the other. It's all of us doing our things, but ensuring that we do it in a way which has maximum impact. and that's where we have to work together. And I think that's crucial because we're always in silos, and climate change is very much about silos. So overcoming that is so crucial.
I also join what you're all like what Kamil said and Mike said, that fighting climate change, it will not be a one solution versus others. It's for me like what I've seen from my research was mainly that policies are pushing, but they're not reaching the targets. Governments are working, putting policies, but they cannot really admit to it. I'm not a fan, actually, as you said, Mike, that the government should interfere and really work and put everything in order, because it's simply it's the mix of politics, and we see that politicians, they want to be re-elected, so they will not really tell the population, okay, we need to increase the carbon tax to fight climate change. So it's, for me, like it's a market mechanism. The market has to lead to climate change. Okay, what our role as tech founders is more to provide the technology to say that, hey, we have here another sustainable solution. We have renewable energy, for example, and government can interfere in financing this technology to reach a competitive edge against, for example, fossil fuels, and then the market mechanism has to work on its own. I guess if government's trying to impose any solutions to the individuals, they will never do this, because they cannot piss off people when they want to get re-elected again. So it's a little bit of yin yang. Problematic, but I guess we got like 3 more minutes, and I would love to ask a question if there are any audience. Do we have any questions or not?
I think there are no audience questions just now.
Okay, no worries. Let's get more like question to on data, and maybe question directed to Prateep and Kamil, because you utilize data in a very interesting way. Actually, I will ask you a very unfamiliar question, okay? From someone who also worked with data, okay? I believe that for some reasons you can really twitch the data to let it say what you want it to say. Do you understand what I mean? We have huge amount of models, statistical models, then you can twist it. You can, when we talk about machine learning, for example, we ourselves use machine learning. If you really do some hyper parameters, you can let the model do what you want to say, or to say what you want it to say. I want to ask, like in 1 minute, every one of you, how do you see this problematic? Do you face it or not? How do you mitigate it?
So it's obviously a big problem, especially in climate change, where the IPCC models that Mike sort of mentioned, they're imperfect, but it's better to use an imperfect model and start informing what the future is going to do than not do anything. Then secondly, when you model the individual hazards, say in our case, like flooding, subsidence, and coastal erosion, we try to apply statistical and stochastic modeling where possible. So we don't want to drop machine learning on anything straight away, because machine learning is like a statistical hammer. And if you can finesse the system with laws of physics, we want to default of that. So we only use machine learning where we need to approximate some missing data inputs, or if the system becomes too complex to normally describe with the laws of physics. But then just to your point around the actual honesty about the numbers. So, what we decided to do is provide an glass box approach, which basically gives you your reliability and accuracy metrics for every single model, And then what we do, we backtest the models going up to 20 years into the past. But we also open up our solution to academic scrutiny. So we invited a few academics, and they've reviewed and peer-reviewed our methodology. And look, the only other thing that you can do is just be very open about the limitations and strengths of the modeling approach. And that's, part of the documentation, that you do let people know that these are all the disclaimers you need to be aware of. So I think this is the maximum one can do when we're talking about projections 80 years into the future until 2100. Sorry, I pause here because I know we're running out of time, and I'm sure Prateep will have some interesting take on that.
Thanks a lot, Kamil. Please, Prateep.
Well, it's a complex problem, the complex question that you've asked. One of the ways in which we try not not to have any analyst arrive at certain number is the different kinds of the different kind of validation methods that you have put as to whatever outputs that we are arriving at. How does it actually go with previously encountered similar real life data point, ground truth data point? Because when you're dealing with satellite imagery, you have to always remember that in itself they may give you limited insights, but it's only with the ground truth data, which is like what you have collected from a location, that feeds as a training data and improves the accuracy of the insights. So that's one very important way of doing the validation. The second one is, I think we also need to have certain standardized AI ethics and data governance, frameworks. A lot of people are working around the globe on that. Unfortunately, it's very use case specific, to be honest, and it should become like a part of your data team's compliance, I believe, as a compulsory compliance, because if policy decisions, if financial decisions are going to be made on these kind of data sets, we rather be right most of the times. We can't be right all the times, but we rather be most of the times. So yeah, I mean, these are questions that the industry is definitely, we are grappling with it. We don't have like the best method to do it, but yeah, these are the ways in which we are tackling it.
Thanks a lot, Prateep. I guess you address very important points, and Mike and Kamil as well. And as you said, the data-driven decisions is a very tricky part. You can really twist the data. However, the EU, for example, is passing new policies to change this. I would love to thank everyone for joining the panel. I guess from the speakers that they are pushing us to end it. It has been a very interesting discussion. We can talk about it for another hour, but I guess the program has to go further. Thanks a lot, Kamil, Mike, and Prateep for joining the panel, and the floor is yours, Amber.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting conversation, and I think there must be people who think like, wait, is it already over? I still want to continue. If this is the case, please let us know. Then we'll bring you into touch with Sherief, Prateep, Mike, and Kamil, and you can continue the conversation. Yeah, I think it was very insightful, and from what I've taken out, we really need to combine different approaches, different ways of activating the individual, but also system thinking. So a lot of work to do. For now, we are moving on to the next session, which is an investment success story. So something a bit more lighter, I think. So I'll hope to see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Thank you, everyone.